Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does brings forth for what we are going through and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Today's guest will be Professor Jossiana Arroyo-Martinez in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and the Department of African and African Diaspora at the University of Texas, Austin, with your host, Wendy Aris, with the topic of discussion, Cities of the Dead, Performing Life in the Caribbean. So let's have a listen.
Thank you so much, Professor Martinez, for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, to speak about your article. We're going to be discussing cities of the dead performing life in Caribbean. Now, of course, we were discussing before that, again, death is part of the whole life circle, but unfortunately, not one of those topics that people really want to be talking about, but it is still a very important topic. So before we start, I'll have you just do a brief introduction of yourself, and then we'll get started.
Yes, thank you for your invitation. I'm really honored to be here in dialogue with you. My name is Jossiana Arroyo-Martinez, and I'm a professor of African and African Diaspora Studies and Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Texas at Austin. I work specifically with African diaspora, literatures and cultures, and my areas are mostly Caribbean studies, Caribbean comparative studies, as you see from this article. This chapter that we're going to be discussing today is part of my new book, Caribes 2.0, New Media, Globalization, and the Afterlives of Disaster, that was published in the Race and Media series at Rutgers University Press.
Perfect.
Yes.
No, so I'll make sure to include that in the show notes as well, so people can be able to get that as well. And excellent. So, on that article, The Cities of the Dead Performing Life in the Caribbean suggests a very complex relationship between life and death in Caribbean societies. Could you just elaborate on how these relationships shape the historical and contemporary dimensions of Caribbean culture?
Yes, I'm happy to elaborate. So for Caribbean histories and stories, slavery, transatlantic slavery was the center of our life and our economies. So I will say that to discuss funeral practices in our histories is pretty much connected to the abduction and to the enforced bringing of human lives to this side of the Atlantic, to our island communities, right? And this is the first thing. So we can start discussing funerals way before the plantation economies, if we look as the sea, right? The Atlantic as our first burial site. So I choose to end, as you notice, the article start with the complexity of plantation economies. And of course, they were very diverse in the Caribbean. Cuba and Haiti had the stronger economies, while in many sites in the Spanish Caribbean, they were not as enforced. And for example, Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic had smaller agricultural spaces. But we can say that the sea was our first space in which a lot of bodies were buried. And this is the theory that Christina Sharps elaborates in The Wake, right? In her study of death and wake in the Afro-American tradition. But this is key for the Afro-diasporic tradition and specifically central for Caribbean bodies. So as we move into plantation economies, then we see this complex views of syncretic religions coming together. First of all, the imposition of Christianized values and religions and rituals for funeral practices for many of the enslaved, and how the enslaved also kind of like memorialize and thought about this rituals in a different way. So this is how many of these funerals practices started, more as a very syncretic practice of Afro and also some European traditions, but with a very, very strong core centered in what they were, bringing in with them in their bodies and in their memories as well.
No, thank you, because that's so true in terms of looking at the sea as the first kind of burial area, because
Yes.
many that were transported from, Africa to the Caribbean, they took their lives. They didn't
Yes.
want to be enslaved. So yes, many, jumped overboard, so to speak, and would rather have died that way than to have lived a life in enslavement in the Caribbean, in this new world that they didn't know of, other than that they were enslaved individuals. So
yes. And this is why I end the article with that, with the sculpture, right? The sculpture that is in the Atlantic that memorializes those lives lost. There's there's a poem, right? Like a song that is written about, not only people jumping up, but a revolt, that happened on one of these ships, and how life ended, but also was kind of like affirmed in modes of resistance. It was a very brutal practice. And this is what I explain to many of my students, because they start, for many reasons, a lot of these topics are not kind of brought up necessarily in middle school or in high school anymore in many schools in the United States. So when they enter to my courses, this is the first time ever that they hear about the Atlantic crossing as brutal as it was, and they might kind of know a little bit about certain films, but they don't understand a lot of these stories as truth, right? So for them, it's really eye-opening. So I need to go there before I start explaining a lot of these complex funeral practices, because they need to understand when they definitely come from. So yeah.
No, absolutely. It's not a narrative that's really told. And it's not only until it's only in your family, even of what they know, they only are passing down what they know from previous generations and what they've seen as well.
Yes.
They can't necessarily give you, where it's coming from, but they just say, we just do that because that's how we honor our ancestors, to ensure that they have a safe passing into the spiritual world, right? So that's one of the things. And, in your analysis, you explored, various cultural artifacts and practices, such as the film Juan de los Muertos and Edward Lau's documentary, La Suida Perdida, and the performative funerals of Funeral Marin. How do these examples illustrate the ways in which Caribbean societies engage with concepts of life, death, and of course, performance?
Yes. So let me start with, I'm going to follow the order that you offered. The film Juan de los Muertos, which was directed by Alejandro Brugués, came out in 2011, but it started as a comic strip that explored the life of Lázaro. In the film, he's called Lázaro, and he is a man who opens a business of taking care of or kind of like killing your loved ones when a zombie apocalypse happens in the city of Havana. So basically here, what interests me is not only the business that is opened up, right? But the fact that the zombie apocalypse is described as a kind of a crisis. And the crisis is related to capital, right? It's related to capitalism. It is related to racial capitalism and the new divisions that, at least after the special period in Cuba, started happening once the economies of the former Russia, right, are not there anymore. The Soviet Empire, the country starts to have a very difficult crisis, and a lot of social classes that were already developing start to get way the difference among classes, right? So this poor community of people are left without, without resources. So the Lazarus work is to kind of like restore some kind of order. And the film brings a lot of the comic strip. I mean, it's a little brutal to watch, but a lot of zombie narratives in the present speak about capitalism, but also about racial terror and social divisions. So for Eduardo Lalo was born in Cuba in the 1960s, but his family emigrated to Puerto Rico. So he's Cuban, Puerto Rican. So La Ciudad Perdida is a documentary a video of 40 minutes that he created when he came back as a student from Paris, and he re-encountered the city of San Juan in the mid 2000s, right? He loves to walk around in the city, and he actually noticed that many communities that were there when he left the island to study were not there anymore. Many people were displaced. And the issue of displacement has been a problem in Puerto Rico for decades, but now is becoming, in the post-Maria world, is becoming really a problem. Many Puerto Ricans have been displaced from their communities, but also a lot of these Airbnb economies are kind of substituting and kind of driving these communities out of their spaces. So the city in Eduardo Lalo's documentary is kind of dead, right? And so what happens when the city is dead? You walk the city, and walking kind of recreates an effective relationship with the space that kind of like recreates home for you, but also kind of like makes it alive again. So this is kind of like what he does. He mixes the city with family narratives, and family and the city kind of like come alive again. But there's a lot of this very complex relationship between life and death is very much present. The performative funerals are a little bit more complex. They started in 2008, and this place, Funeraria Marin, and actually the director and a woman embalmer. I mean, and she is the daughter of the owner. She's the one who started doing a lot of these curatorial funerals. And basically it started with this younger man, Angel Luis Pantojas, who had a very violent death due to his life. You know, he was a messenger for this drug traffickers, and he was murdered. But what is really interesting is that he requested to be standing up. You know, he requested to have his funeral outside of the casket, but also his body embalmed in a way that people will see him and look at him as if he was alive. So this is how his funeral became kind of like the beginning of all of these other requests that Funeraria Marin started handling from that moment on. So this performative funerals have became kind of like, and you mentioned that you have seen some of them around, and it's because they became a staple in diaspora communities as well, particularly in cities such as New Orleans and in New York and New Jersey, where you have pretty much a lot of Caribbean communities. So there's something, and this is where Christina Sharp comes in. I mean, Christina Sharp sees as a form of understanding death in communities where death has been kind of like a staple, not only of violence, but also of our way of understanding family and rituals. So we are in this Black Lives Matter post, after lives of slavery, as Sarilla Hartman argues, right? Moment. So this is a way for me, these funerals are a way of taking care of the body, taking care of those who have passed, and in their final, in these final rites, be together with the body. So I see a form of mourning that kind of like, in a way, it's not necessarily denying death, but it's kind of like creating a closeness with this body in a moment of grief and deep loss.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. And it's just a great honor for them to be able to do those final wishes as well.
Yes.
So,
Yeah,
I mean, I know
I
that
believe so.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I know that you mentioned in terms of the notion of performing life is central to your discussion. Can you explain what this concept entails and how it manifests in everyday lives of individuals in the Caribbean?
Yes. So performing life, it's associated, I mean, for me, with my kind of my take on how capital has become so central in our life. So our bodies and lives have been kind of like centered and more connected into these economies of survival. So what in the past was kind of considered only a problem of the poor or the underclass has become kind of the problem for all. We are all connected to these economies of survival in one way or another because the economic crisis is crossing our lives. So many of us are scripted into this reality where performing life and kind of like being more drawn into these economies of survival through life has become the staple and I wrote a lot of this chapter way before the COVID pandemic, before we had our big closing into our homes, right? We were self-enclosed for 2 years. And you need to add this now into what performing life means. So this is how, for me, practices of care, of taking care, not only, at the level of the curatorial, but also into the self, right? Into our living are so important. So this is a meditation on death and survival but it's also a meditation on how to live better. How is it possible for certain societies and communities to look for ways of living better in the present, and how could we do that? And yes, the tone of this essay might sound to many people like a pessimistic one, but we see in the present many groups and communities that are precisely doing this. They're gathering together and working toward ways of performing life that do not entail the sacrifice of the spirit, or do not entail hard labor. And the only way we could do this is through collaboration and community. And of course, this is something that exceeds my essay, but definitely is part of the message about performing life.
No, that's great.
Yes.
Because we, as you said, mentioned with the pandemic, the fact that we are coming together as a community, seeing things very similar, clearly,
Yes.
and to be able to have those discussions, because I think that is the most important out of all, is to really have those discussions and to be able to have, be open and receptive to receiving whatever that is, and to be able to work together as a community.
Yes.
Is great.
Yes.
I know that you mentioned about the idea of melancholia,
Yes.
as a lens through which to understand, social action and expression in Caribbean societies. How does melancholia intersect with the performances of life and death that you examined in your art?
Yes. So melancholia it has been studied. And of course, we know Freud's very quoted essay on melancholia and grief. And basically what he explains, his essay has been criticized from many angles, particularly in relation to gender and race. But the basic of his idea is that melancholia happens when you lose someone or something that becomes so important to you that it gets that person or that memory gets introjected into your psychic life in a way that person or that co-presence, that object becomes part of yourself. So this is how we introject grief and loss. And I think that melancholia is very important to our present. We are definitely, and it has been for decades. if we look at the ways colonialism and racial capitalism has kind of like shaped many of our stories and lives, but in relation to Caribbean societies is pretty much central to understand how not only grief, but also mourning and loss operates in the present as a self-affirming practice. It's not that we only move from pain. It's that we use grief as a form of restorative practice in daily life. So this is how melancholia is pretty much present. And I think about many of our scholars. I mean, I think about Edouard Glissant, and I think about Derek Walcott. I mean, and they come from so many different traditions, but in many ways they write about life and death with a very melancholic stride. And I think this is pretty much connected to the way we became like type of survival communities, right? In our daily life. So this is how I see melancholia, particularly through social action, but also through daily practices.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great, because I know with my aunt, she mentioned in terms of melancholia, but not necessarily the fact that people used grief as a moving forward, but kind of got stuck in it.
Yes.
And they could not be able to move onwards, which I thought was very interesting in your article, which is, because
it could happen too.
They get stuck.
This happens. Grief is about temporality, and it's not even. It's a feeling, right? And I mean, that comes in waves. So this is how the sea metaphors that we were discussing at the beginning, we were talking about the ocean, but also grief and melancholia, I mean, comes in waves. And sometimes you feel stuck. Sometimes there's days in which you feel a little better. But these memories sometimes do not leave your body at all. So you need to work through them and navigate, So this is, again, the sea metaphors come in, navigate them in a way in which you're able to go through your life in the present, right? And for me, I mean, at least for me, as I was mentioning, as we started talking, the practices of working with my altars, working with my ancestors, help to kind of negotiate grief, but also give me some sustenance as well, right? And this is how spirituality and why spirituality is important, because doing this on your own, yes, gets you stuck, right? Into the pain, and there's losses. I mean, like, for example, maternal, paternal losses that are really hard to come to terms with. And I mentioned this not in this article, but in my book, in the introduction, the people who had to say goodbye to their loved ones during the pandemic. And at the beginning, you couldn't even be close to those bodies. I mean, how could you overcome this type of loss? It's really difficult. It's really difficult. So this is how, I don't know, talking to them, maintaining their images. I mean, putting like some light into their spaces. I mean, creating a place in which you can meditate and talk to them. Rebecca, she has a new book. It's called, oh my gosh, her name escapes me at this moment, but she has this amazing theory about co-presences, which Jackie Alexander works with as well in her incredible book, Pedagogies of Crossing. I mean, what does it mean to have your ancestors as co-presences in your life? I mean, it could be and Jackie Alexander goes into the many, like the good and the bad, right? They could guide you. They could misguide you. I mean, they could be voices here and there, but it's an important practice, nevertheless, to understand. Rebecca Hay Colon, yes, her new book on transatlantic spiritualism is she discusses Yemaya, Oshun, and all of the spiritual deities as important co-presences for spiritualists to guide them, particularly creation of altars and other forms of living within them, within these practices.
No,
Yeah.
no, absolutely,
Yes.
because it is all very connected and it's all very important. And as well, you touched on the concept of necropolitics,
Yes.
articulated by Achille Mbembe. How
Mm.
do the performances of life and death in the Caribbean reflect or respond to forms of power and control, both historical and contemporary?
Yes, and thank you for bringing that because Chilimambi he had to write against all these European notions of cruelty, loss, and violence by actually saying, and that's what he says in Necropolitics. Wait a minute, the plantation was the first micro lab of control and power and colonialism in the world, not only in the Americas, in the world. I mean, it gave the script of what it became later on, the camps, and, the German genocide camps. So necropolitics, and the practices of horror and violence in relationship to the death, the violent death process life in the Caribbean. And he makes a really important point in his theory of necropolitics, not only about the plantation, but also and the camp. He says what happens on these bodies that not only die violently, they are definitely dying because they are living in these ways of structural racism, right? They're living under the control of capital. So they are selected, right? They are kind of like put as sacrificial bodies. So he's reading necropolitics with the idea, the ideas, the theories of Giorgio Agamben, but he's also deconstructing Agamben and saying, wait a minute, you cannot look at all these theories without looking at colonialism and racial colonialism as the laboratory of these experiences. And as we see with within our present, Black Death is still part of this script. And there is no difference, and although in Puerto Rico, poverty also marks a lot of the social differences, right, in relation to color, you can still look at these racialized bodies. I mean, they are mostly, I mean, mostly masculine. I mean, discussing gang violence, but also they are feminine. I mean, that the larger deaths of women. I mean, that are. I mean, they're happening in the Caribbean. They're all over. They're happening in South America. They're happening in North America. It's alarming. It's alarming. Like how. I mean, and we were discussing the pandemic. The pandemic actually kind of like pressed a lot of these issues of domestic violence to the forefront because people were inside their homes, and many of these women could not escape this violence. So it's definitely necropolitics, but also, and I discussed this also in my book, is the relationship of the necropolitical in relation to the image. I mean, what could we do with these images of death? Are they helping us as communities, or are they re-traumatizing us, creating this notion of exhaustion in many ways, right? Even when these videos of death come to the forefront, justice is not served properly. I mean, so what are we doing? I mean, what is the circularity of death that is abounding us? Is it necessary to look at these images? At the beginning of my book, I discuss, the question of citizenship for Dominicans of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic has become a pretty strong issue. Since 2013, they created the sentence, La Sentencia, which is a law in which many Dominicans of Haitian descent need to naturalize their status, and they need to work with their papers or look for papers. Yeah. But the date they put, which is 1929, is making really impossible for many of these families to look for the correct paperwork. So there's been a lot of violence happening. And I work with the image. I didn't post the image in the book. It's not there. I decided not to. But basically the death of this Haitian man, that they accused him of robbing a lamp in a lotto ticket. He was murdered by this group of civilians, I think. And he was murdered, but then his body was hanged from a tree. So this is kind of like what I'm trying to say. I mean, like, to hang the body from a tree is to talk about this necro image reference that for us is pretty much connected to images of lynching, and specifically lynching photography. I mean, which is kind of like pretty much connected to the US South, but not necessarily. For us, for Caribbean peoples, these are images like pretty much connected to history, right? We see them as many the surveillance, right, that many of our communities dealt with, kind of like put a lot of this extrajudicial killings, right, as part of a way of creating fear into our communities. So the problem that this image created online is something that I also explain in the book, because the discussions that happen in the internet became kind of like really absurd at some point. They started with ethnic affiliation at the beginning. No, he's Dominican, not he's Haitian, not he's Dominican, because you cannot tell. You look at us from the outside. How can you tell? But also, they ended up with comments such as, this is not a real body. So this is how, I mean, and again, the necropolitical becomes part of the image in kind of like very, very strange connections, but it leads into all of these questions in relation to the social, but also into what do we do when in many ways we are not honoring, we're not honoring, but desacralizing the human, Black humanity. So what happens with that? So yes, complex questions, but I mean, I don't sit completely with the group of Afro pessimists that say, well, death definitely sits at the core of the plans of the state for Black communities. I do not sit completely with that theory, but sometimes some parts of my research kind of like dialogue with that theory as well. It's not possible to leave that theory out when we discuss our present, particularly in relation to the necro-political and Black deaths. You cannot ignore that, and I'm thinking about the work of Frank Wilkerson III and many other, Joao Vargas, many other Afro-pessimist scholars.
No, because what that image that you described, you're right, is very historical in the sense, especially, of course, when the enslaved Africans came over on the ship, that was used by captains in terms of a form of control.
Yes.
Everything that you just said. And they would hang people by their feet, if not
exactly.
By their hand. And there's images that have been drawn on that. And to say that was from that point in time to still continuing into conference. This is a very important, topic, because it's still used in the same way. It's still used as a form of control, a form of fear, to control somebody. So, or a group of people, but it's just, what you said, to have it defined as that is even.
Yes. And when I started looking at this performative funerals, I started looking back into Victorian photography. There's a form of Victorian photography that is related to the dead, right? And it became really, really large, of course, in Europe, but it started in London, right? In the Victorian era. And then it moved into the United States. people particularly became really, really important here in certain moments, but particularly after the Civil War, when a lot of younger women were losing their husbands to the war and they were losing children. So they will take all these pictures with their children, with their deceased husbands, if they could recuperate their bodies. So many, when I presented this essay, they will say, okay, so this looks definitely like Victorian photography. And I was like, no, this is interesting, because a lot of this photography was used later as photography developed as a technology to work with images in relation to spirituality. So they will create these effects, right, within the photography to kind of like work with spirit and try to materialize the spirit in the photograph. Mm-hmm. So I thought about all these technologies as I was looking and working with the photographies provided or taken by, and a lot of the photographies that include in this essay were taken by journalists that went into the funerals. And for some, I had to ask permissions to use them, from the family members, of course. But for others, permissions were offered from the journalists. But the way the iconicity of the image kind of like works in relation to Black bodies is really important to me when we look at these funerals. And of course, in Puerto Rico and also in the diaspora, I mean, these bodies are multiracial, right? Many of them, in the case of Puerto Rico, multiracial and multi-age. Even a grandmother decided that she wanted to have this funeral done this way. So the family paid for her, I mean, to be sitting in the rocking chair. So it is pretty much, to me, something that relates to the economies of care, and how we are refusing, or some people are refusing to kind of embrace this category of invisibility and displacement, a complete displacement in relation to their families, but also in relationship to the state.
Sorry about what you've mentioned. It's a lot to do with identity and memory and heritage, and it all intersects, and performances of life and death in the Caribbean societies, as explored in your article. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Okay. Yes. Performances of life and death in the Caribbean. So they are plenty. And I mean, I will start just by saying that in Caribbean societies, we're always blamed. We're always blamed by others as peoples who cannot separate joy from sadness. Like, they're always like, I always hear this critique, like, why you, even in the saddest like moments, like they become joyous, and vice versa. Like, you don't separate these emotions. And it's a critique that comes always. But I've seen, particularly not only in Puerto Rico, but in other societies. I mean, Trinidad, for example, I mean, carnivals, but also very, very serious spaces of mourning kind of like intersect. In Puerto Rico, for example, as the country in the last 2 or 3 decades, protest has been kind of central to the Puerto Rican archipelago, particularly since the mid 1990s, where we lost a lot of economic privileges or economic subsidies from the United States. So the crisis has become more and more stronger. So a lot of spaces of protest, for example, either become festive or become really, really like stronger places in which you could see kind of like the joyous, the festive, and the funeral kind of like coming up together. So there's been a lot of performative funerals in a lot of events. And I include some in my book, One of the ones I mentioned is the like the symbolic funeral created for the Commonwealth. Like, for example, like they did a performative funeral for the political system. There was another funeral made for the practice of blackface. So the Black movement in Puerto Rico kind of like say, so we're done with blackface. But by doing this, I mean, they put this character that appeared in television since the 1970s, and she was trying to come back during election year because of her story. She has a connection with, I mean, she has a song. She wanted to be, it's a character of a woman who wanted to be governor, right? So they put her to rest, but they prepare a funeral for her. So, I mean, so funerals in Puerto Rican society kind of like talk about something that is important. I mean, a person but I mean, it's a way of honoring, but they mix, they could be mixed with other things that are not necessarily associated with the funeral per se, but they could be at certain moments festive, etc. The painting El Velorio by Francisco Oller from 1893 is one of the most iconic representations, right, of this complex practice in Puerto Rican society. And in that painting, Oller was criticizing, and the painting represents the iconic Velorio de Angelito. It's called the Baquiné, and Baquinés were Afro-Hispanic traditions. So they had a lot of African components, but they had also a lot of Hispanic, particularly from the Canary Island and from the south of Spain influences as well. So they were done only for babies who pass away. So they were prohibited at some point because they were like, well, the state was like, well, how could you do this festivity like for a week, right? With music, dance, and other things that are not necessarily mourning. But finally, I will add that in relationship to protest, this was kind of like really important for our summer 19 when our former governor had to, quit governance of the island. He was actually expelled by the people. So this protest that actually lasted 2 weeks, people went into the street, were also related to a form of mourning, because the protest started as this chat, this private chat that was happening on WhatsApp or on one of these apps got public. And the governor and his group of people, right, his assistants were making fun of the dead. In this case, these were the dead, the people affected by Hurricane Maria. I mean, official ciphers say like almost 5,000 people, but definitely there were more. So this actually precipitated this protest on summer of 19. So I think that at least in the Puerto Rican archipelago, people take very seriously the respect for the death. So this is why I don't see necessarily these funerals as a practice of disrespect, as some people will kind of look at them. It's quite the opposite. It's a way of feeling closeness and mourning family members in a joyous way.
No, definitely. And I know that we talked about a lot of different ways in terms of with performances of life and death in the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. In what ways would it have, I guess, either challenge or subvert the dominant narratives and representations of the region?
Oh, this is really, that's a really big question. I think that a lot of these performances of life and death are about challenging and subversion. I mean, I'm very cautious of not calling them agency moments constantly because as many practices, they are filled with assertion and kind of accommodation And this is why they are negotiating space, right? But as it happens, not only in Puerto Rico, but we can think about New Orleans, as Joseph Roche does in relation to Carnival, but also in relation to daily life, communities affected pretty strongly by natural disasters. As we know, Katrina was one of the largest natural disasters in the United States. Those communities have not recuperated yet. And many of those who recuperated, they have to migrate. Houston became a different city after Katrina. Texas also shift as we got a lot of these immigrants. So this connection between our daily realities, affected by natural disasters, by the economies of a corrupt state, and how these elites kind of take advantage of, they live for themselves, but they don't care about the rest. Make a lot of these practices coming from below, right? Negotiations in the realms of power. And I will say, because as we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I'm a believer. Conjuring is a really important thing that we do in our daily life. So this is how we could look at the pragmatics of not only rituals that become public like these funerals, but also daily life. Conjuring in daily life becomes a way of looking at subverting and creating agency for yourself, for as an individual, but also for your own family and community.
No, thank
So
you
yes,
on that. And
yes.
finally, as we close out, what do you see, I guess, of the future directions of research in this area? And are there any particular aspects of Caribbean life and culture that you believe warrant more investigation?
Oh, that's a really amazing question. I think there's many ways of working with this area. I just saw my colleague. There's a colleague, Ricky Bird. She came a couple of weeks here to UT Austin to present her work. She is a scholar of media studies, but she also works in the fashion industry. So she's looking at the Rest in Peace t-shirts that have become so important for African Americans, particularly decades. They were being used by family members in funerals in decades before Black Lives Matter. But after Black Lives Matter, they have taken another tone into the present. So she was explaining how this, many of them, have shifted, right? To not only, they include the pictures of the deceased, but sometimes it's the pictures of the deceased, family members, and they have become objects in which people memorialize those who have passed. So that's a way. I've seen it happening, particularly with the Rest in Peace t-shirts. I think everything related to this connection that was mentioning before between joy and sadness. The relationship between joy, sadness, and grief is another area to study. Not only with daily life rituals, but also with spirituality. I've seen, and this is an area that I'm moving on. It's more of a digital area. I'm looking, and I know that many of my students are doing this as well. Some of them are doing this as a dissertation project. I'm doing a lot of research on spiritual sites online. What are they doing? Like, what are they doing in relation to the present? Many of the sites are kind of like directed by younger women, younger Black women in many areas of the United States, but also in the diaspora, but also non-binary folk, which to me is kind of like really interesting. This relationship between spirituality and gender, in particularly the divine feminine, or what we can see as the divine feminine. So it's kind of really interesting to see how these places these digital sites work as energy, right, for others. And whatever they're doing, I mean, even with tarot, with cards, or with channeling, and many of these younger women and folk are mediums. So they channel while they're talking, to people. And yes, you can say pragmatically, this is a way of them for making money, but also this is a way of kind of like performing an affect and bringing some sort of light or energy into communities. So this is another area of interest, particularly in relation to spirituality and the present, that I think it's interesting and connects very well with not only life and death, but also affect in our very dire neoliberal present.
Thank you. Thank you
Yes.
so much. I really do appreciate your time, Professor
Thank
Martinez, to come
you.
on and speak about a topic that, not a lot of people want to discuss, but it is very something that is very present, and that we really do need to acknowledge what, has happened in the past, and what our ancestors have gone through for us to be here as well, and to honor that as well, to know what those all individual things mean and how they're connected. So I do appreciate your time for coming on and speaking.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day, and wonderful to meet you. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.